The editor of the Albany Mail could not deny that the passenger's account of the wreck of the Indus, as originally published in the Times of Ceylon, would be of interest to his readers. But the statements made in it were full of frustration and allegations made against Captain Breeze that the editor put in an unusual disclaimer for 1885 ahead of the article. Quote, "We are not, of course, responsible for the opinions of our correspondent. He need not have worried about the impact of the inflammatory words of the account of the passengers. The following inquiry would agree that Captain Breeze had indeed been negligent."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the lost history of the Indus?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Indus had originally been ordered by the Cunard Line, but the Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company, or P&O Line, took over the contract before she was ever launched. The Indus was finished in 1871, a single-screw steamship with an iron hull. She was quickly put to work on a route carrying both passengers and cargo between India and England. It was on this route that the Indus left Madras on the afternoon of the 8th of November, a Saturday, headed to her next stop, Colombo, in Sri Lanka, before she was going to continue on to London. One of the passengers would later say that on returning to his cabin around 6:15 a.m., having had an early breakfast, he had noticed with some surprise that they were within the sight of land. Though he had not thought anything of it, assuming that the crew knew their business, he was therefore shocked when, only a couple of minutes after this, a shock ran through the ship. Everyone ran onto the deck to find the Indus was now grounded and grating on the bottom, with the shore about 4 miles distant. Though the passengers did not know it had been swept into a strong southerly current in the night, and this had not been noticed by the crew, they had just struck a sandbank, going about 12 knots. The next few hours were spent with the ship first being put in reverse at full power in the hopes of getting free, and then when that failed, switching between forward and backing in the hopes that it would work. No discernible impact from their efforts could be seen, and the passengers put their heads together and then approached Captain Breeze and suggested that it might be time to jettison the cargo. Captain Breeze had no interest in such a suggestion, however, and by noon, with no progress still being made, the passengers requested permission of the captain to go to shore in the ship's boats. This was also refused, so all the passengers could do was sit and watch the efforts. There was no real alarm or panic among any of the people on the ship, passengers or crew. The Indus was firmly grounded and showed no sign of tipping or ending up in a worse position. But that did not make the passengers any less anxious to be either sailing soon or to be placed on shore. Though Captain Breeze would not allow the passengers to leave the ship in boats, around midday he did order that his second and fifth officer take one of the boats and go to Trincomalee, where they would be able to telegraph the P&O agents of the ship's grounding. The wind was coming from the north, which would allow the boat to hoist a sail and make good progress in that direction. This was the first that the passengers had heard of their actual position, which was about 70 miles to the north of Trincomalee, and therefore 20 or 30 miles from their intended course. It was a fact that Captain Breeze had very few excuses for, since the morning had been clear and calm. No poor weather or strong winds had been present to drive them off course. After 8 or 10 hours of the ship becoming more stuck rather than less, and the passengers repeatedly suggesting they lighten the cargo, the captain decided that the answer was to try to pull the ship off of the sand using the ship's anchor. The anchor was dropped ahead of the ship, since there was deeper water there, and the hope was that they would be able to navigate the shoal and continue their voyage if they could just get off the sandbar. But this too was a failure. Without thinking much of it, the anchor was allowed to stay where it was. Sunday night was a calm one, with the passengers doing their best to sleep under the circumstances. Though there was no rough wind or sea, the ship still rose and fell a little with every swell, bumping against the bottom in a way that reminded everyone on board what sort of situation they were in. The next morning, everyone on board was met with a new surprise. The main hatch was now full of water, whereas previously the ship had at least been watertight. It was soon found that during the night the ship had managed to ride up on the anchor that it had dropped the day before, and then had continued to go backwards and forwards on it, ripping the bottom out of the ship. Captain Breeze still wanted to try to continue on to Trincomalee, having faith in the ship's watertight compartments. But that would require his ship to get free, something that was becoming less and less likely. In light of this development, the passengers of the Indus, as a united front, went to the captain once again, demanding to be put on shore. The captain initially refused again, saying that it was too dangerous and there was no good landing to be had. But after their continued insistence, he allowed 2 of the passengers and the third mate to try to scout out a good landing that could be used by the passengers to leave the ship. In spite of Captain Breeze's repeated assertions that there was no good landing point, the scouting boat returned after a couple of hours with the news that they had been able to find land easily. This news made the rest of the passengers even more determined to go on shore. During the time that the boat had been gone, the ship had continued to fill up with water, and it was beginning to alarm them. The passengers were finally allowed to leave the ship as they wished, but even though their things were piled up on the deck, they were not allowed to take any of their luggage. They were allowed to bring some wraps to keep them warm, and some provisions to eat, but that was all. It was in this way that they landed in Mulativu, a fishing village. The shipwrecked travelers made their way to the local rest house and did their best to get comfortable. Once they were settled and had a chance to look around Mulativu a little, they could not help but notice that it was a fishing village and there was no shortage of boats that could have come to their aid. The passengers asked the locals why it was that such aid had not been offered, but the answer given was a simple one. At no time had the Indus flown a distress signal or fired a signal gun. So the people of Mulativu had assumed that their help was not wanted or needed. They assured the passengers that, had such a signal been given, they would have immediately come to the ship's aid. Looking around the village, the passenger whose account was published in the Times of Ceylon could not help but consider once again the passenger's suggestion that they jettison some of the cargo. Even if Captain Breeze had not been willing to lose his cargo, there were dozens of boats that could have been at his disposal to bring it to safety on shore and lighten the ship all the same. The passengers, their luggage in mind, returned to the ship on Tuesday morning, only to find their luggage was gone. The Indus had begun to settle deeper and deeper with the weight of the water she was taking on, allowing the sea to now sweep her. The passengers' luggage had remained as it had been left, piled on the deck, and as waves had begun to wash over the ship, the passengers' luggage had gone overboard. They did learn that Captain Breeze had finally made the concession of lightening the ship by throwing overboard a few hundred sacks of wheat, but it was done at a point where the ship was already full of water, and it was a meaningless gesture. Shortly after the passengers had arrived on the Indus again, and made the unpleasant discovery about their luggage, another ship appeared on the horizon and approached them. It proved to be the Ranger, which took all the passengers on board and brought them safely in Trincomalee. Captain Breeze and his men remained on the Indus, the ship's boats out and at the ready in case the ship started to slide and they needed to evacuate quickly. The passengers were put up by the local gentry for the night in Trincomalee. The next morning, the Clyde, which was carrying the agents from the P&O line from Colombo, picked up the passengers in Trincomalee, and they once again returned to the site of the wrecked Indus. This time, they found that the stern of the Indus was completely underwater, and the seas were breaking over the ship constantly. The Clyde could not get close to the Indus without putting herself in danger, so one of her boats was launched with the agents of the P&O line, the captain of the Clyde, and 2 divers that had been hired by the P&O line to assess damages. They quickly concluded that there was nothing that could be done, either for the ship or the cargo, which was now underwater. Captain Breeze and his crew were still on the forward of the ship and refused to leave even though the ship was declared a total loss. In this light, the P&O agents hired a local brig to stand by the wreck and render assistance when it was inevitably needed, and the Clyde continued her voyage. The Clyde eventually dropped the passengers off in Bombay to make their way home. But the passengers were, as a whole, very vocal about how they felt that the ship had been managed and the way that the wreck had been managed afterwards. By the 17th, it was announced that the Indus was now completely underwater and that Captain Breeze and his men had been forced to retreat to the nearby brig. With them, they brought the ship's books, the specie on board, and the mail that they had been carrying. Almost as soon as a Clyde had dropped the passengers off in Bombay, it rushed to take the Indus's place in the mail service. Captain Breeze's actions and the passengers' allegations were quickly the talk of the newspapers. That the ship was off course was undeniable, and all that the papers could say was that she was by no means the first P&O ship to wreck along that coast in the past 30 years. That the ship had hauled herself on her own anchor during high tide did seem negligent, especially that it had not been caught before the ship had been allowed to gut herself on it completely. The passengers' lost luggage was a sore spot throughout the discussions, and some of the passengers said that they would testify in the inquiry, as well as demand payment from the P&O line for their lost property on the grounds of negligence. Here, public opinion seemed in their favor. It was hard to disagree with the idea that since the passengers had been able to land, it should have been easy to send a couple of boats with their luggage as well, especially since at that point the Indus was definitely not going anywhere. The point where at least one paper would come to the defense of Captain Breeze was that he did not allow the passengers to leave the ship immediately and was reluctant to do so until the very end. The paper pointed out that the P&O line had a reputation as a safe line, because while they might sometimes lose captains or crew, they did not lose passengers. The paper pointed out that a ship's boat can easily capsize, and Captain Breeze might have reasonably worried about making matters worse for himself by tarnishing the line's reputation after already losing them a ship and cargo. Captain Breeze would eventually have his captain's certificate suspended for a year by the inquiry. It was felt that some of the things that he had done definitely amounted to negligence. The matter of the cargo was also a topic of newspaper speculation, though what became of it is not entirely known. Her cargo was listed as including indigo, tea, and wheat, in addition to the specie already mentioned. It is the cargo that is not mentioned that is of the most interest to modern audiences, however. On board of the Indus, there had also been goods that had been classified as private cargo, freight that belonged to people in India, which was being sent to England. Among this cargo were some items belonging to Sir Alexander Cunningham. Sir Alexander Cunningham was originally an archaeological surveyor from 1861 to 1865, and then was the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India from 1871 to 1885. As part of his terms of his first appointment, Cunningham had shares in all of his finds. He had collected a huge private collection of coins and other historically significant items by the time that he retired on September 30th, 1885, at the age of 71. He sent his belongings to Calcutta to be shipped to London in anticipation of him leaving India. The Indus arrived in Calcutta on the 15th of October, just in time to be selected to carry at least a portion of Cunningham's goods. There is no exact manifest of exactly what was in Cunningham's goods on the Indus, but this has led to a lot of speculation, as well as some educated guesses. It is known through journals and other documents where Cunningham visited while he was an archaeological surveyor and able to claim a portion of the items for himself, and his collection was known to include coins, seals, and other objects that he considered to be the best out of what he had found while working in that position. It is to be assumed that some of this was part of the cargo of the Indus, though Cunningham personally traveled with as much of his coin collection, which he later sold to the British Museum in his lifetime. What people took to the Indus the most for is not coins, but is instead rumored pieces of the stupa of Bharhut, which Cunningham visited in 1874 and 1876. At this point, he was working as a Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, which did not have the right to a finder's fee that his original post did. In his own records, Cunningham says that he sent the most valuable sculptures to Calcutta, where they were placed in the Indian Museum. What remained, said, was scavenged by locals and building materials by the time that he had returned 2 years later. It is therefore unlikely that any of the pieces of the stupa were part of the cargo of the Indus. It is an idea that has captivated historians and archaeologists since it was brought up, and even before that, the idea of any part of Cunningham's collection was on board of the Indus has captured the imagination. Mentions of the possibility of finding any part of it date back as far as the 1920s. Where the Indus rested exactly was a barrier in excavation for years. Her exact position was not clear in any of the records, and rumor had it she sank too deep for excavation. In 2013, the Maritime Archaeology Unit of the Central Cultural Fund of Sri Lanka announced that they had found where the wreck of the SS Indus was, covered in fishing nets. This was a source of great excitement, and there was talk about an archaeological excavation, though none seems to have followed. If there is one in the future, it is possible that they will be disappointed. In a letter on the 13th of August, 1886, Cunningham wrote to a friend that he had received 18 boxes from the wreck. By his description, 6 of the boxes contained artifacts, though he does not say what kind, and it is not certain what became of them. Dr. Sanjay Garg, writer of Cunningham's Lost Treasures, suggests that it would be worthwhile to look through the records of the British Museum and see what all Cunningham sold to them. Cunningham says that most of the boxes on the Indus had contained personal records, documents, and pictures, all destroyed by the salt water. Considering the nature of his life's work, this was indeed most likely a terrible blow to the documentation of ruins across India, as well as the items that were found there. Whether or not there is still part of his cargo at the bottom of the sea near Mullaitivu, Sri Lanka.
For more information about the wreck of the Indus, please see the Albany Mail from Tuesday, December 15th, 1885, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.